December 1944. The air inside the truck was a stale coffin of scents, cold iron, damp wool, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. It was a fear that had long ago curdled into something harder, a resilient bitterness that lined the women's stomachs more reliably than food. They were the vanquished, the remnants of a dream forged in black shirts and Roman salutes, now rattling across a continent that was not their own, a landscape scrubbed clean of the familiar terrors of war and replaced with a quiet, unnerving emptiness. Their faces, framed by the rough collars of their coats, were a collection of sharp angles and hollows, sculpted by years of conviction, conflict, and finally, capture. These were the women of the Servizio Ausiliario Femminile, soldiers of the Italian Social Republic, and they carried their defeat like a shroud, a garment of pride and defiance against the coming humiliation. Their minds were fortresses, built from the rubble of their cities and mortared with the powerful cement of ideology. They knew the Americans. They had been taught, had seen the posters, had heard the speeches of the Duce and the Führer. The Americans were a mongrel race of capitalists and jazz-crazed degenerates, a nation of soft-bellied merchants who had stumbled into a war of giants. Their strength was a hollow thing, a product of factories, not of will. They were undisciplined, decadent, and ultimately weak. The women expected their prison to be a reflection of this soul-deep chaos. Disorganized, cruel in a careless and inefficient way, a place where their captors' inherent inferiority would reveal itself in every grimy corner and every meager, poorly cooked meal. They steeled themselves for this, for the quiet satisfaction of seeing their propaganda confirmed in the flesh. It was the last weapon they possessed, the certainty of their enemy's decay. The truck shuddered to a halt. The rear canvas was thrown back, flooding the darkness with a flat gray light that seemed to bleach the world of color. The cold was a physical blow, sharp and clean, so different from the damp chill of the Apennines. As they were herded out, their boots crunching on gravel that seemed too uniform, too deliberate, they saw it. The camp. It was not the squalid pen they had envisioned. The barracks were laid out in unnervingly straight lines, constructed of dark, creosoted wood. There were no ramshackle fences, but tall, tautly stretched wire that gleamed with a kind of geometric perfection. It was clean, odorless. The orderliness of the place was the first crack in their fortress of certainty, a dissonance that hummed just beneath the surface of their stoicism. They were processed with a chilling, detached efficiency, a series of forms and examinations that felt less like the act of a conqueror and more like the intake process of a well-run, if soulless, factory. But they had not yet seen the true nature of the weapon that would dismantle them, a weapon more potent than any bomb or bullet, because it targeted the very foundations of their belief. If you find this descent into the psychology of war captivating, remember to like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. Our community thrives on a shared passion for the past. The first meal was the true beginning of their war, a silent internal conflict that would prove far more devastating than any firefight. They were led into a long, cavernous hall, the air thick with the unfamiliar smells of boiled coffee and soap. The tables were plain, but scrubbed clean. The sound was a low din of clattering trays and muted conversations in English, a language that sounded soft and indistinct to their ears. They moved down the line, receiving their portions onto metal trays with a practiced, sullen grace. There was a stew of some kind, thick with meat and vegetables, a piece of white bread that was shockingly soft, and a mug of steaming black coffee. It was more food, and of better quality, than most of them had seen in years, even before their capture. But they ate with suspicion, their eyes darting around, searching for the trick, the hidden cost of this strange generosity. They were prisoners, enemies. This was not how the vanquished were meant to be treated. The sergeant, a woman whose face was a mask of hard-won authority, watched her women. She saw the subtle widening of their eyes, the way they held the bread as if it were a precious artifact. She had kept them together through the retreat, through the shame of surrender, her will a steel rod for their spines. She had warned them to expect nothing, to show no weakness. Yet here, in this sterile hall, a tremor of confusion was running through them. They were being fed, not starved. It was a tactic, she reasoned, a psychological ploy to soften them, to make them compliant. They would show these simple-minded Americans that Italian spirit could not be bought with a warm meal. They would eat, regain their strength, and remain unbroken. They would chew this food and transform it into pure, unadulterated contempt. Then the trays came out, carried by other prisoners, German men with weary, expressionless faces, and placed at intervals along the long tables. On the trays were pies, deep-dish pies with golden latticed crusts, steam ghosting from the vents, carrying a scent that was entirely alien to them. It was a sweet, warm, intoxicating aroma of baked fruit and exotic spice. Cinnamon, they would later learn. Slices were cut and distributed, a wedge of impossible luxury landing on each of their trays. It was apple pie, a dessert, a triviality, a thing of peacetime, of celebrations, of grandmothers' kitchens, and a world away from the blood and mud they knew. They stared at it, this wedge of golden pastry and soft, spiced fruit, as if it were a live grenade. It was in the face of this simple dessert that the first true cracks in their ideological armor began to show, thin as a spider's web, yet profoundly deep. Did this moment of unexpected encounter surprise you? Let us know in the comments what you think the women's initial reaction to this gesture was. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more untold stories. The initial reaction was a silent, collective wave of derision. A pie. How utterly, laughably American. This was the enemy, a nation that fought its wars and then served its captured foes dessert. To the sergeant, it was the ultimate proof of their decadence. This was not the behavior of a serious people, a warrior race. This was the gesture of a soft, sentimental culture that did not understand the fundamental nature of conflict, the sacred hatred that must exist between enemies. She watched as one of the younger girls, a recruit barely 18, tentatively poked at the slice with her fork. The girl's movements were hesitant, her expression a mixture of deep-seated suspicion and an almost childlike curiosity. This was the danger, the sergeant thought. This was the poison hidden within the sweetness. They were attempting to infantilize them, to lull them into a state of docile gratitude with sugar and baked fruit. They did not eat it, not at first. The slices sat on their trays, objects of intense scrutiny and cynical debate conducted entirely through narrowed eyes and the barest flicker of a shared smirk. They had survived on hardtack and chicory coffee, had known the gnawing emptiness of a belly fed only on patriotism. They had seen children starving in the streets of their own cities, their tiny bodies bloated from hunger. To be offered this confection felt like an insult. It was a mockery of their suffering, a boastful display of a wealth so vast and unthinking that it could be casually discarded on the plates of its enemies. They would not partake in this theatrical display of false magnanimity. They would leave the pie untouched, a silent testament to their unbroken will. A small act of defiance, but a deeply significant one. But hunger is a primal force, and the aroma was a persistent, insidious tempter. It filled the hall, a sweet counterpoint to the bitterness in their hearts. A few of the women, after a long, silent struggle, finally broke. A fork would dip into the soft filling, lifting a small portion to suspicious lips. There was no sudden illness, no trick. There was only the taste. An explosion of flavor that was both shocking and deeply, profoundly confusing. The sweetness of the apples cooked to a perfect tenderness. The subtle warmth of the cinnamon, a spice many had only heard of. The buttery, flaky texture of the crust. It was a taste of a world they could not comprehend, a world of effortless abundance. The sergeant watched as the expressions on the faces of those who tasted it changed. The defiance flickered, replaced by a raw, unguarded bewilderment. The pie was not a weapon of overt cruelty, but of a subtler, more corrosive kind. It did not attack the body, it attacked the soul. This psychological battle, fought over something as simple as a dessert, is a powerful example of how war is waged on all fronts. If you agree, give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who appreciates nuanced history. The next day, it was there again, and the day after that. It was not a one-time gesture, not a welcome ceremony for new prisoners. The pie, or some variation of it, a cobbler, a pudding, a cake, was a permanent fixture of the evening meal. It was routine. It was mundane. This realization was far more destabilizing than the initial shock. A single act of generosity could be dismissed as propaganda. But a system of generosity and infrastructure of desert was something else entirely. It spoke not of a fleeting sentiment, but of a deeply ingrained reality. This was simply how things were done here. The women began to watch their captors more closely, searching for the cracks in this facade of benevolent order. They watched the American guards, young men who looked more like farm boys than soldiers, who chewed gum and leaned on their rifles with a casual indolence that was both infuriating and fascinating. They saw the supply trucks arriving each morning, a seemingly endless convoy of vehicles disgorging crates of food. Crates of oranges, of fresh meat, of flour and sugar in sacks larger than a man. They saw the warehouses vast and filled to the rafters. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the logistics began to dawn on them. This was not a performance for their benefit. They were a tiny, insignificant part of a colossal machine of supply and consumption that operated with a relentless, humming efficiency. The food they were given, the pie that had so shocked them, was not a special provision. It was surplus. It was the casual overflow of a system so productive, so mind-bogglingly wealthy, that it could afford to feed its enemies better than they had fed their own soldiers. This systematic daily evidence created a profound cognitive dissonance. Their entire worldview was predicated on the idea of struggle, of scarcity as a virtue that forged strong souls and hard nations. Italy was old, proud, and poor. Germany was efficient, disciplined, and fighting a war on a dozen fronts, its resources stretched to the breaking point. The narrative they had been fed was one of heroic sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds, a spiritual battle against the corrupting influence of material wealth. Yet here, the material wealth was the weapon. It was a force of nature, an avalanche of calories and commodities that seemed to mock their years of deprivation. How could a nation so soft, so decadent, be so powerful? How could a people who valued comfort so highly also possess the industrial and organizational might to wage a global war with such apparent ease? The world as they knew it was beginning to unravel, not with a bang, but with the quiet, persistent, daily serving of a slice of pie. The power of mundane reality to shatter ideology is a recurring theme in history. If you're fascinated by this concept, subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss our next video exploring similar historical turning points. The psychological impact was a slow-acting poison. The initial contempt curdled into a confusing brew of emotions, envy, humiliation, and a grudging, resentful awe. The sergeant felt it most acutely. She was a product of a system that valorized sacrifice. She remembered the Gold for the Fatherland campaigns, where women had donated their wedding rings to fund the war effort. She remembered the strict rationing, the meager gardens planted in city squares, the constant gnawing hunger that was presented as a patriotic duty. Every meal in the American camp was a refutation of that entire ethos. It was a silent, damning judgment on the system she had fought and bled for. A system that could not even provide its own people with bread, let alone provide its enemies with dessert. The women began to talk amongst themselves, not in open debate, but in hushed, furtive whispers after the lights were out. The conversations were fragmented, full of a shared, unspoken understanding. They spoke of home. One woman recalled her brother's letters from the Russian front, his obsessive descriptions of the quarter loaf of bread he was allotted each day. Another spoke of her mother, trying to make soup from potato peels and bone scraps in a cold Milan apartment. These memories, once sources of a shared, grim pride in their resilience, now felt like evidence of a colossal failure. They were the tales of a people who had been asked to build an empire out of rhetoric and dust, while their enemy was building one out of steel and wheat. The most humiliating moments were the small, mundane ones. Seeing a guard carelessly toss a half-eaten apple into a bin, watching a prisoner scrape a leftover piece of pie into the garbage. This casual disregard for food was more shocking than any act of cruelty could ever have been. It was the behavior of a people for whom scarcity was a concept so alien it was literally unimaginable. To the Italian women who had been taught to lick their plates clean, to waste not a single crumb, this was a form of sacrilege. It was the ultimate display of power, not the power of the gun or the jackboot, but the power of a full pantry, of an endless harvest. It made them feel small. It made them feel primitive. It made them feel, for the first time, not just defeated, but irrelevant. Their ideology had no answer for this. It had prepared them for hardship, for pain, for a glorious death. It had not prepared them for the soul-crushing silent superiority of a well-stocked kitchen. Uncover more about the psychological warfare of World War II. Hit subscribe to join a community dedicated to understanding the deeper, more human stories of conflict. Your support helps us create more content like this. The comparison became a constant, corrosive internal monologue. Every aspect of their life in the camp was juxtaposed with their life back in the Republic. The thin, lumpy mattresses in their barracks were a world away from the cold ground or straw-filled sacks they had known. The hot water in the showers, a luxury they could use for a few minutes each day, felt more decadent than a Roman bath. The camp infirmary was stocked with medicines, sulfa drugs, penicillin, aspirin, that were rarer than gold on the front lines, where a dirty wound was often a death sentence. They saw a doctor for minor ailments, a dentist for an aching tooth. This level of care extended to them, their enemies, was a concept so foreign it defied their understanding of the world's brutal logic. The sergeant found herself observing the Americans with a new analytical eye. She began to see past the caricature of the lazy, gum-chewing degenerate. She saw the quiet competence of the camp administrators, the relentless logic of their schedules and systems. She saw the engineers who maintained the camp's generators and water pumps, men who could fix complex machinery with an unthinking ease. She saw the quartermasters with their clipboards and their endless lists, orchestrating a flow of goods that was as complex and vital as any battle plan. This was the source of their power, she realized. It was not in the spirit of the individual soldier, but in the strength of the system. It was a nation that had mastered the art of organization on a scale she could barely conceive. They had turned logistics into a form of magic. This realization was profoundly demoralizing. They had been taught that the Italians, as heirs to Rome, were the masters of organization, of building, of civilization. They had been told that their passion and spirit would triumph over the cold, mechanical efficiency of the Anglo-Saxon world. But here was the evidence, laid bare before them every single day, that the opposite was true. The Americans were the new Romans. They built camps like small cities in the middle of nowhere. They moved armies and all their sustenance across oceans. They fought a war of production, of spreadsheets and supply chains, and they were winning it so decisively that the overflow of their victory was apple pie for their prisoners. It was a defeat on a civilizational level. The women grew quieter, more withdrawn. The hard shell of their defiance was being dissolved from the inside out, not by force, but by the relentless daily evidence of a reality that was simply, undeniably superior. If this analysis of systemic power versus ideological fervor resonates with you, support our channel by subscribing. We delve into these complex themes every week, and your subscription ensures you won't miss out. The war had stripped them of their homes, their freedom, and their future. Now, this strange, comfortable captivity was stripping them of their past, or at least the version of it they had believed in. Their memories were being recontextualized. The stirring speeches of the Duce, which had once filled them with a burning sense of purpose, now echoed in their minds as hollow and delusional. His promises of a new Roman Empire, of Italian dominance in the Mediterranean, seemed like the ravings of a madman when contrasted with the quiet, overwhelming reality of a single American supply depot. The propaganda posters depicting heroic Italian soldiers and cowering, cartoonish Americans now seemed like a pathetic joke. They had been lied to, not just about the enemy, but about themselves. This dawning awareness was a deeply personal and isolating experience for each woman. There was no collective moment of epiphany, no shared catharsis. It was a private erosion of the soul. The younger recruit, the one who had been so full of fervent belief, now spent her days in a state of quiet melancholy. The world she had been promised did not exist. The cause she had been willing to die for was built on a foundation of fantasy. The cynical veteran who had always harbored a sliver of doubt felt a grim, hollow vindication that brought her no comfort. She had suspected the system was rotten, but she had never imagined the sheer scale of its inadequacy. The gap between their ambition and their capability was not a crack. It was a chasm. The The sergeant struggled most of all. Her identity was forged in her belief in the cause. She was a soldier, a leader. Her purpose was to embody the strength and discipline of the new Italy. But how could she maintain that discipline, that sense of superiority, when her captors demonstrated a superior form of it in every aspect of their daily operations? How could she preach the virtues of sacrifice to her women when they were living in greater comfort as prisoners than they had as soldiers? She felt like a fraud. Her authority, once absolute, now felt like a costume she was wearing. She still gave the orders, maintained the routines, but the fire in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, weary confusion. The taste of apple pie had become the taste of their own failure. It was the sweetness of a truth so bitter it threatened to choke them. History is filled with these moments of profound ideological collision. Join our community of history lovers by subscribing to the channel. Let's explore these fascinating stories together. The culmination of this psychological transformation did not occur in a single dramatic moment, but rather as a slow, creeping dawn of understanding. Yet, if one were to pinpoint a symbolic turning point, it would be a quiet evening in the mess hall just before Christmas. The camp was decorated with a strange, almost surreal festivity. There were paper garlands and a large pine tree in the corner, adorned with lights. The Americans were making an effort to celebrate their holiday, and by extension, they included the prisoners in this strange ritual. A special meal was served, and at the end of it, the pie appeared as always. But this time, it felt different. The act was no longer just about sustenance or routine. It was about culture. The sergeant sat at her usual place, watching her women. The initial suspicion had long since evaporated, replaced by a kind of weary acceptance. They ate the pie now without hesitation. For many, it was the one moment of the day that offered a flicker of something other than the gray monotony of their existence. It was a simple, reliable pleasure in a world that had been stripped of them. But tonight, the sergeant looked at her slice of pie and did not see food. She saw a story of a world so fundamentally different from her own that it operated on a different set of physical and spiritual laws. She saw the vast, sprawling orchards of a distant state, perhaps Washington or Michigan, where the trees groaned with so much fruit that it could be harvested, processed, and shipped across a continent. She saw the steel mills of a place called Pittsburgh, where the ore was torn from the earth and forged into the tin for the cans that held the apple filling. She saw the sprawling farmlands of the Midwest, a sea of wheat so immense that the flour for this single crust was an immeasurably tiny fraction of its bounty. She saw the complex web of railways and highways, a circulatory system of commerce and supply that moved these goods from one end of the nation to the other with an unthinking, practiced ease. She saw the factories that mass-produced the ovens, the mixing bowls, the forks, and the trays. She saw the society that had organized all this, a society that valued efficiency and production and comfort to such a degree that it had become the most powerful force on the planet. The pie was not a pie. It was a symbol. It was the final, undeniable manifestation of an entire civilization's power. The realization that a simple object can represent the might of a nation is a powerful one. If you want to see more content that decodes the symbols of history, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. In that moment, the sergeant understood the true nature of their defeat. They had not been fighting an army. They had been fighting a factory. They had not been engaged in a battle of wills, but in a contest of production. And in that contest, they had been hopelessly, tragically outmatched from the very beginning. Their passion, their fanaticism, their willingness to die, all of these things were meaningless when pitted against a nation that could produce tanks, ships, planes, and apple pies on an industrial scale simultaneously without apparent strain. Their war was a thing of spirit and sacrifice. The American war was a thing of logistics and assembly lines. This was a truth more devastating than any military loss. A lost battle could be blamed on a bad general, on poor weather, on a stroke of bad luck. But this was a fundamental systemic failure. It meant that their entire ideology, their entire way of life, was not just wrong, but irrelevant. It was an antique, a relic of a past age, trying to compete in a modern world it did not comprehend. The new Roman Empire they had dreamed of was a pathetic fantasy, a historical reenactment society trying to fight a war against a corporation. They had brought rhetoric and beautifully designed uniforms to a fight that required spreadsheets and freight capacity. She looked across the hall at the American guards, the young, boyish faces she had once dismissed as soft and decadent. She saw them now in a different light. They were not the architects of this power, but they were its effortless inheritors. They had been born into it. This abundance, this confidence, this casual mastery of the material world, it was their birthright. They did not have to be fanatics. They did not need a messianic leader screaming at them from a balcony. The system itself was the source of their strength. It hummed along, producing victory as a simple byproduct of its daily function, just as it produced apple pie. The guards were not fierce warriors in the way her men had been, but they didn't need to be. The machine did the fighting for them. The war was over, not just on the battlefields of Europe, but here, in her own mind. The surrender had already happened. The rest was just a formality. Understanding the economic and industrial engines behind warfare provides a completely new perspective on history. Like this video if you agree, and comment below with other examples of soft power that have had a huge impact on historical events. This profound internal shift was the true climax of their war. From that day forward, the women of the Italian contingent were different. The last vestiges of their defiant pride crumbled away, replaced by a quiet, contemplative resignation. They performed their duties, they followed the rules, but they moved like people who had seen a ghost, the ghost of their own dead ideology. The conversations in the barracks died down, replaced by a heavy silence. There was nothing left to say. They had been believers in a failed God, and now they were simply going through the motions in a world that no longer made sense to them. The sergeant's leadership changed as well. She no longer tried to stoke the fires of their nationalist pride. Instead, her focus shifted to simple, practical survival. She ensured her women were healthy, that they took advantage of the medical care, that they wrote letters home. She was preparing them not for a continuation of the fight, but for a return to a world they would now see through new eyes. She was shepherding them through the ruins of their own belief system. Her hardness remained, but it was no longer the sharp, aggressive edge of a zealot. It was the dense, heavy resignation of someone who has been forced to accept an unbearable truth. The remaining months of their captivity passed in a blur of routine. The seasons changed outside the wire fence. The news of the final German collapse, of the death of the Duce, reached them as distant, almost abstract events. It was merely the official confirmation of what they had already learned in the mess hall. The war had not ended for them in a hail of bullets, but with the quiet, persistent, daily taste of cinnamon and baked apples. It was a strange, almost absurd epitaph for their cause. They had set out to conquer the world, to forge a new destiny in fire and blood, and in the end, they had been conquered by a desert. The simplicity of it was both a final, crushing humiliation and, in a strange way, a kind of release. They had been absolved of their grand, impossible purpose. They were no longer soldiers in a great crusade. They were just women, waiting to go home. The journey from fanaticism to resignation is a powerful human story. If our narrative has moved you, please consider subscribing. We are committed to telling the stories that lie beneath the surface of historical events. The war in Europe ended. The camps began to empty. The day finally came when the Italian women were told they would be repatriated. The news was received not with jubilation, but with a quiet, anxious apprehension. Home. What was home now? It was a place of rubble and shame, a country on the losing side of history, a landscape of memories they now knew to be false. The world they were returning to was the world of scarcity and struggle they had left behind, but they were no longer the same people. They had seen the other side. They had tasted a different reality, and that knowledge could never be unlearned. Their journey back across the Atlantic was the reverse of their arrival, yet it felt entirely different. The ocean seemed larger, the future more uncertain. They were no longer buoyed by the false confidence of their ideology. They were adrift. During the long voyage, they spoke very little of their time in the camp. It was a shared, unspoken trauma. They did not need to discuss the pie, the bread, the endless supply of everything. It was a memory that lived in each of them, a permanent part of their internal landscape. It was the benchmark against which they would measure the rest of their lives. When they finally set foot on Italian soil, in a port city scarred by Allied bombing, the contrast was a physical shock. The gray, gaunt faces of their countrymen, the patched and threadbare clothing, the ever-present sense of hunger and desperation in the air. This was the reality of their heroic nation. It was a land of deprivation. For years, they had been told this was a noble sacrifice. Now they saw it for what it was, a catastrophic failure of a system that had promised them glory and delivered only ruin. They saw their people queuing for a loaf of coarse, dark bread, and they remembered the soft, white slices they had been given 3 times a day. They saw children with the telltale signs of malnutrition, and they remembered the guards throwing away apples. The memory of the camp was not a fond one. It was a haunting. It was the constant, silent whisper in the back of their minds that everything they had fought for was a lie so profound that it had been exposed by the simple, mundane existence of a piece of fruit pie. The long-term psychological effects of war are often more devastating than the physical wounds. We believe these stories need to be told. If you agree, subscribe to our channel and join the conversation in the comments below. In the years that followed, the women scattered, trying to rebuild their lives from the ashes. They married, raised families, grew old. Most never spoke of their time as soldiers in the Servizio Ausiliario Femminile. It was a chapter of their lives tainted with the shame of a cause that was not only defeated, but absurd. Yet the memory of their time as prisoners in America remained, a strange and powerful legacy. It became a secret knowledge they carried within them, a story they could never fully explain to those who had not been there. How do you tell your husband, who fought and starved on the Eastern Front, that your will to fight was broken by a desert? How do you explain to your children, who are growing up in the new American-influenced Italy of the Marshall Plan, that the force that reshaped their world first revealed itself to you on a prison tray? For the sergeant, the memory was a constant companion. She lived a quiet life in a small northern town, a long way from the grand stages of history she had once dreamed of occupying. She saw the influx of American goods, American movies, American culture. She saw her country slowly and painstakingly rebuild itself in the image of its conqueror, and she was not surprised. She had seen the blueprint for this new world years before, in the clean, orderly lines of a prison camp and the impossible abundance of its kitchen. She understood in a way that few others could, that the victory had not been won at Normandy or at Midway. It had been won in the factories of Detroit and the wheat fields of Kansas. Sometimes, on a special occasion, her daughter would bake a pie, an apple pie, from a recipe learned from an American magazine. The aroma would fill the small house, the warm, sweet scent of cinnamon and baked fruit. And in those moments, the sergeant would be transported back to that long, cavernous hall. She would see the faces of her women, young and hard and full of a faith that was about to be shattered. She would feel the cold weight of the metal tray in her hands. She would taste the sweetness and the bitterness all at once. It was the taste of a lost war, a dead ideology, and a profound, life-altering truth. It was the taste of a world that had moved on, leaving her and her cause behind in the dust. The true legacy of their experience was not just the memory of defeat, but the quiet, enduring knowledge of why they had been defeated. It was a lesson learned not from a history book, but from a simple, undeniable, and utterly overwhelming slice of American apple pie. Thank you for joining us on this historical journey. The stories of those who lived through these transformative moments are the bedrock of our understanding of the past. To ensure you don't miss our future explorations, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Your support makes this work possible.